There is a comforting story we tell ourselves about technology, that if something is open source, it is open by definition, that the license is the truth and the repository is the proof. But what if openness is not just about whether you can download the code? What if it is about when you can see it, when you can react to it, and whether you are allowed to exist inside the process while it is still alive? Android never announced that it was changing. There was no funeral, no scandal, no dramatic moment where the doors slammed shut. Instead, something far more subtle happened. The clock moved. The distance between decision and disclosure grew. And an operating system that once let you watch it being built began to ask you to wait. This is not the story of Android becoming closed. This is the story of Android quietly stopping being open in time. You can almost pinpoint the moment Android stopped feeling like a place you could walk around in and started feeling like a building you were only allowed to visit after it opened. Not because the doors slammed shut, not because a license changed, not because someone stood on a stage and declared the end of open source. It was quieter than that, and that is why it matters. Android did not close overnight. Android kept publishing code. Android kept wearing the badge. But the experience of openness, the sensation that the platform was being built in front of you, began to dissolve. The clock drifted. The distance between what was happening and what you were allowed to see grew from hours to weeks, from weeks to months, until openness stopped being something you participated in and became something you received. This story is about that drift. Not a conspiracy, not a betrayal in a single act, but a long chain of reasonable decisions that added up to a new definition of what open means. Android is still open source, but it is no longer open in time. Openness has shifted from a process to a schedule. To understand what that sentence actually implies, you have to go back to the era when Android felt messy, when it felt alive, when it was not yet the operating system of the planet, but a kind of public workshop. In those early years, the people who fell in love with Android did not fall in love with polished hardware. They fell in love with motion. They fell in love with the sense that the operating system had a visible bloodstream. The ritual mattered. You sat down at a desk that looked like a desk, not a lab bench. You opened a terminal that did not belong to a corporate dashboard. And you pulled. You synced. You watched text cascade. You watched history download. You watched decisions become code. That simple loop, pulling source and building it, created an intimacy that is hard to explain to anyone who arrived later, when phones became sealed slabs and software became a service. Back then, you did not just install Android, you observed it. Intimacy did not come from kindness. It came from the nature of the project at the time. Android was young enough that it could afford to be rough around the edges, and knew enough that Google still needed the credibility of openness to win a war it could not win on hardware. Apple had the myth, the singular product, the narrative of a closed garden that felt like a luxury hotel. Android needed something else. It needed an invitation. It needed a story that said, this is the mobile operating system that is not owned by a single device. This is the platform that can belong to many manufacturers, many carriers, many countries, many price tiers, and yes, many tinkerers. The promise was not just that the code would be available. The promise was that the building would be visible while it was being built. Visibility meant friction, and early Android had plenty of it. The platform was a monolith in practice, even if it spoke the language of layers. If you wanted to change something, you often had to touch more of the system than you expected. Hardware support could be fragile. Drivers were not always elegant. Interfaces shifted. Things broke. And that breakage did not scare off the early community. It attracted them. Because when something breaks and you can see the parts, you can also see the path to fixing it. The culture that formed around early Android was not a consumer culture. It was a workshop culture. It was people trading patches, sharing builds, comparing kernel tweaks, reporting regressions, and learning the strange geography of a phone that could be treated like a small Linux machine if you were stubborn enough. This is the context in which the custom ROM era makes sense. It was not just a hobby. It was a social structure. It was a distributed development community that treated phones as adaptable objects, not finished products. When people talk about the golden days of ROMs, they often romanticize it as rebellion, but it was closer to a kind of folk engineering. The hardware was imperfect, the software was unfinished, and the community filled the gaps. They built features that manufacturers ignored. They removed bloat that carriers demanded. They shipped fixes that official updates took months to deliver. Most importantly, they normalized the idea that the source code was not merely a legal artifact. It was the operating system itself living in public. There is a reason the command to synchronize the Android source became almost ceremonial. It was the closest thing Android had to a public town square. When you pulled code, you were not just downloading files. You were downloading narrative. Commit messages were small windows into internal priorities. Comments, even the mundane ones, told you what engineers were worried about. You could track patterns. You could sense what was being emphasized. You could see when a subsystem was being refactored, when a feature was being prototyped, when something was being ripped out and replaced. And because the changes came in a steady stream, not as rare dumps, you could follow the story in increments. You could watch the mess. You could watch the debate. You could watch the OS develop as a process. That phrase, open as a process rather than a license, sounds philosophical until you remember what it felt like in practice. In the early years, the time gap between an announcement and the code being available was often small enough to feel irrelevant. Sometimes it was simultaneous. The corporation and the community were not separate clocks. They were closer to one shared rhythm. That shared rhythm created a kind of trust that did not require faith. You did not have to believe that something existed. You could see it land. You did not have to guess what the platform was becoming. You could inspect the direction. Even when you disagreed, even when you hated a change, there was a sense that the argument could happen in the open, or at least that you could witness its residue. Of course, even in the era of visibility, not everything was truly open in the romantic sense. Hardware was always the pressure point. Android's relationship with silicon vendors and device manufacturers was always complicated because the business incentives did not align with pure openness. Chip vendors guarded their implementation details. Manufacturers differentiated with proprietary features. Carriers demanded control. And Google itself was building services that would become central to the platform experience, even if they were not part of the open source base. Yet despite these tensions, the flow of development still felt legible. The project still felt like something you could track. Then scale arrived, and scale changes what a platform is allowed to be. By the mid-2010s, Android was no longer primarily a hacker's playground. It was an industrial system. It was running on an explosion of devices across every price tier, across every continent. built by companies with wildly different engineering maturity. It was carrying banking apps, government services, and healthcare portals, two-factor authentication, location history, family photos, entire lives. When an operating system becomes infrastructure, messiness stops being charming. It becomes risk, it becomes cost, it becomes liability. The same chaos that enabled participation also enabled inconsistency. And inconsistency is poison for an ecosystem that depends on predictable behavior across billions of devices. This is the moment when the story often gets flattened into a morality play, as if openness was sacrificed for greed. But the more uncomfortable truth is that many of the changes that narrowed openness were motivated by stability, and stability was not a fake need. Stability was demanded by the very success Android had achieved. Application developers needed predictable APIs. Users needed reliability. Governments and enterprises needed security and compliance. Manufacturers needed a platform they could integrate without drowning. And Google needed to hold the ecosystem together as it sprawled, because if Android fractured into incompatible variants, the entire promise of a unified app economy would collapse. So the platform professionalized. It did not announce itself as professionalization. It arrived through process, through documents, through tests, through compatibility rules that sound boring until you realize they are governance. The compatibility layer, with its test suites and definition documents, did more than ensure apps ran correctly. It shifted power. It established the idea that to be Android in the way the market recognizes, you must comply. And to comply, you must accept a rulebook whose author has the final say. In the early era, being part of Android could mean compiling code and flashing a build. In the professional era, being part of Android meant passing compliance gates. This is where a new kind of Android worker becomes central. The integration engineer replaces the hobbyist. The work becomes less about inventing new behaviors in the operating system and more about aligning a product with an increasingly strict specification so it can ship with the services consumers expect. This shift is not inherently evil. It is normal for maturing platforms. But it has a side effect that matters for openness, because the more the ecosystem depends on compliance, the more the project's center of gravity shifts toward partners who ship millions of devices, not contributors who ship patches. At the same time, the scale of hardware diversity created a structural problem that Android could not solve by community energy alone. Updates were slow, not only because manufacturers were lazy or carriers were stubborn, but because the architecture made updates expensive. The deeper you go into the stack, the more entangled hardware and software become. Every platform update risked breaking the low-level integration between the operating system and the device-specific implementation. Chip vendors provided support packages that were not designed for long life. Manufacturers layered customizations that increased the cost of merging new platform code. Carriers added another gate. The result was a system where security patches and platform improvements took too long to reach too many devices. The public blamed manufacturers. Manufacturers blamed carriers. Carriers blamed testing. Google blamed fragmentation. And the community watching this mess believed openness alone was not enough to force updates. The solution that emerged was architectural separation. The idea was simple to describe and hard to execute. if you can define a stable interface between the device-specific implementation and the core framework. You can update the framework without rewriting the hardware side every time. You can reduce the cost of platform updates. You can make Android behave more like an OS that can be maintained. This is where the re-architecture that would later be celebrated as a technical triumph enters the story, because it is simultaneously a victory for users and a step toward opacity. When Android formalized the separation between vendor and system, it created a border. Borders create efficiency, but they also create jurisdiction. Once there is a contract line, you can say, with more clarity, which side belongs to whom. The system side, the part that holds the framework and much of the platform logic, becomes the domain of the platform owner. The vendor side, full of hardware-specific code and proprietary components, becomes the domain of partners. This division is necessary for updates, but it also formalizes a two-world Android. One world is public and governed by an open-source project. The other world is private and governed by partner relationships, NDAs, and proprietary blobs that are required for the device to function. In the early days, the existence of proprietary blobs was an annoyance and sometimes a showstopper, but it did not feel like the entire platform was structured around them. As the architecture matured, the proprietary foundation became more standardized and more essential. It became a bedrock you could not reasonably replace. The community could still build and modify the system layer, but they were building on top of a foundation they could not inspect. That is not a purely philosophical issue. It affects security research, it affects device longevity, it affects the ability to create forks that remain competitive, and it affects the psychological sense of ownership. You can change the wallpaper in a house, but you cannot access the basement. Eventually, you stop claiming you own the house. Now, even at this stage, Android was still open in time more often than people remember. The code still flowed. The repositories were still active. The public could still track development to a meaningful degree. But this is where the invisible shift begins. Not the closure of code, but the relocation of development velocity. Large manufacturers do not operate on the same schedule as hobbyists. They plan around product cycles. They need lead time. They need to integrate new platform versions with new chipsets, new cameras, new radios, new sensors, new compliance requirements. They need months. And when you operate at that scale, you cannot wait for public source drops to begin work. You need access earlier because the hardware you will ship does not exist yet in the public world. It exists in prototype labs. It exists on internal branches. It exists in spreadsheets and roadmaps. The partner ecosystem, by necessity, sees the future before the public does. That alone does not kill openness. The critical part is what happens next, when the platform owner begins optimizing development to serve this partner ecosystem. Once you accept that partners need early access, you create a reality where there is always an internal version ahead of the public version. And once that internal version exists, you create pressure to clean, scrub, and sanitize changes before publishing them publicly, because internal development often contains references, experiments, and dependencies that are not meant to be exposed. That process takes time. It introduces delays. It flattens history. The public repository becomes less of a live workshop and more of a curated archive. The difference between a steady stream of commits and a single large dump is not just aesthetic. It changes how outsiders can understand the project. When changes arrive as a dump, you lose the granularity that makes the code base legible. You lose the ability to follow the incremental reasoning that led to a design. You lose the small debates embedded in commit messages. You lose the ability to identify when something changed and why in a way that is actionable for downstream projects. You receive the final state without the developmental story. In other words, you become an audience. The code is still open, but the process is no longer shared. For custom ROM developers and independent maintainers, this shift feels like trying to learn a language by reading only final drafts of novels, never seeing the practice exercises, never hearing the conversations, never watching the edits. It is possible, but exhausting. And exhaustion is how communities die, not outrage. When the work becomes too heavy, volunteers quietly leave. While this was happening, another transformation began, one that would eventually make the question of openness even stranger. Android started breaking itself into modules. On paper, modularization is an update strategy. It is a way to deliver improvements faster, especially security fixes, without requiring a full system update from a manufacturer or a carrier. In practice, it becomes a new distribution channel for the operating system itself. And once the OS can update itself through a channel controlled by one entity, the center of gravity shifts again. For years, the Achilles heel of Android security was the update pipeline. Vulnerabilities could be fixed in the platform code, but that did not mean they were fixed on devices. Too many gates, too many parties, too much testing, too many incentives to delay. Google, watching the damage to user trust, could not accept a system where the safety of billions depended on carriers and OEM schedules. So it moved the pipeline. It decided to deliver critical components directly. This is where a particular kind of engineering brilliance becomes culturally consequential. Core parts of the system that used to be updated only through full firmware releases became deliverable units, not just apps, but core libraries and services. The technical mechanism matters less here than the effect. The phone could receive updates to key components through a channel that resembles an app store. Even if the modules are not simple apps, the user barely notices. A small update arrives. Security improves. Compatibility improves. The platform becomes more consistent across devices. This is the part of the story where most users win. But it is also the part of the story where the open source community loses a kind of leverage. Because even if the source code for these components is published, the binary that runs on most consumer devices is delivered by the platform owner. It is signed, verified, and expected to come from a trusted pipeline. If you are not part of that pipeline, you can compile your own version, but you cannot easily replace the version running on locked devices. The ability to participate shifts from code access to distribution access. And distribution access is not something open source automatically grants. Distribution access is governed by keys, signing, verification, and the trust model of modern devices. This is not unique to Android. It is how secure consumer electronics work. The difference is that when an open source operating system becomes tightly coupled to a proprietary distribution pipeline for its most critical updates, openness becomes more abstract. You can read the code, but you cannot practically deploy your changes to the mainstream ecosystem. You can understand, but you cannot intervene. That is a profound change from the era where a teenager with enough patience could build a ROM and have it running on thousands of devices. As modularization expanded, the boundary between Open Android and Google Android became sharper. The open source base remained, but the lived reality of Android on consumer devices increasingly depended on proprietary services and modules. If you built Android purely from the open source code, you could produce a system that booted, but it would often feel skeletal compared to what users expect. Many of the features that define the modern Android experience live in layers that are not part of the open source base. Some of those layers are proprietary apps, some are services, some are tightly integrated APIs that third-party developers rely on. The more this happens, the more AOSP becomes a base that exists in theory and for certain use cases, while the mainstream Android experience becomes something else. This is why the ship of Theseus metaphor keeps returning in discussions about Android openness. If you replace enough parts of the system with modules delivered through a controlled pipeline, if the core experience depends on proprietary services, if the public repository reflects the past more than the present, at what point does the label open source stop matching lived reality? Legally, the answer can remain yes. Culturally, the answer becomes complicated. Then comes the change that is less about what Android is made of and more about how Android is made. The internal development model shifts toward a single trunk, always stable, always green, always ready to ship. This is a mature engineering practice. It reduces merge hell. It increases velocity. It improves quality. It makes it easier to cut releases on demand. For a platform the size of Android, it is almost inevitable. But it carries an irony that matters for openness, because the more you insist the trunk must remain stable, the more you rely on feature flags and configuration to hide unfinished work. In the old model, seeing code land often implied that it was active, or at least that it was meaningfully part of the near future. In a trunk-stable, flag-driven world, code can exist in the public tree but be dormant. It can be compiled but inert. It can be present but not real in the way users experience it. Features can be developed behind toggles, tested internally, enabled for a small subset of devices, and only later activated broadly. The release becomes less about code landing and more about a switch being flipped. This shift is subtle, but enormous. It changes the relationship between the public observer and the platform. If you are watching the repository, you can read the logic, but you cannot always know what is running in production. You cannot always know which paths are active, which flags are enabled, which configurations are deployed. That information lives in a different layer, often controlled by the platform owners. So even when the code is public, the behavior is not fully legible. Openness becomes text without immediate consequence. For security researchers, this creates a fog. A vulnerability may exist in code, but is it reachable if the feature is disabled? A fix may exist, but is it deployed? A patch may be present in a later internal configuration, but not yet visible publicly. In the classic open source model, many eyes can inspect and reason about what is happening because the source and the running behavior are closely aligned. In the flag-driven model, source is necessary but not sufficient for understanding reality. Reality is partly defined by configuration, and configuration is not always public. At this point, the narrative could still be framed as a series of technical optimizations that happen to inconvenience hobbyists. But then the calendar itself changes and the thesis becomes unavoidable. Android is no longer open in time. When a platform owner reduces the number of public source releases, it does not necessarily reduce openness in a legal sense. The code still arrives, the licenses remain, but the rhythm changes, and rhythm is how communities stay synchronized. In earlier eras, more frequent public drops, whether through steady commits or regular releases, meant downstream projects could track the platform's movement with manageable effort. They could rebase often. They could catch regressions earlier. They could contribute feedback before decisions hardened. They could maintain a sense of being in the same world as the platform owner. When the cadence slows, the delta grows. Weeks of internal change become months. The difference between the public baseline and the shipping reality expands. This expansion has a compounding cost. The longer you wait, the more conflicts accumulate. The more conflicts accumulate, the more time it takes to reconcile them. The more time it takes, the more volunteer energy is consumed. Eventually, the work stops being a hobby and becomes a second job. And when a hobby becomes a second job, most people quit. This is the time tax, and it is not paid equally. Large OEMs can afford it. Chip vendors can afford it. They have teams, budgets, schedules. They integrate changes as part of their product lifecycle. They attend partner briefings. They receive early access. Their engineers work within the privileged timeline. But a community project, even a respected one, operates on a different economic model. It operates on spare time, on passion, on donations. It cannot easily bridge a 6-month gap between public source and internal reality. It cannot afford to chase a moving target it cannot see. So the ecosystem narrows, not because anyone explicitly bans alternatives, but because the cost of being an alternative increases. If you want to build a serious fork, you need to recreate more of the proprietary ecosystem. You need to keep up with modular updates. You need to maintain compatibility with security and integrity checks. You need to handle signed components. You need to keep pace with architectural changes that arrive in large drops rather than visible streams. Each of these requirements is survivable. Together, they form a filter that only organizations with significant resources can pass. This is where the story intersects with corporate winners. And it is not a story of villains cackling. It is a story of incentives aligning. A slower, more predictable public release schedule benefits the industrial supply chain. Chip vendors can align their support packages. OEMs can coordinate product launches. Certification timelines become clearer. Marketing windows become more reliable. Devices ship with fewer last-minute surprises. In the consumer world, this can mean better products. But the cost is participation. Predictability beats participation. The ecosystem becomes more like a managed platform and less like an open commons. The open source community is still allowed to exist, but it is pushed into a slower lane. It becomes reactive rather than co-present. The role shifts from collaborator to historian. Nowhere is this tension clearer than in security. In the idealized open source model, security is strengthened by visibility. Bugs are found and debated openly. Patches can be audited. Many eyes reduce the chance that a vulnerability remains hidden. In practice, large-scale consumer security often requires coordination and responsible disclosure. You do not always want details of a vulnerability broadcast before the majority of devices are patched. So private branches and partner early access can be justified as a way to protect users. The question is not whether private coordination should exist. The question is, What happens when private coordination becomes the dominant mode and public visibility becomes retrospective? When partners receive patches weeks before the public sees the code, the public is asked to trust that the fix is correct, that it has no unintended consequences, that it does not introduce new issues, and that it is applied consistently across devices. Trust is not inherently bad. Modern life runs on trust in systems too complex to verify individually. But open source was supposed to reduce the need for trust by enabling verification. When verification becomes delayed, open source becomes less about trustlessness and more about branding. This is why the phrase security without transparency stings. It is not that devices are unsafe. In many ways, they are safer than ever. The point is that safety is delivered as a service by a small number of entities, and the public codebase becomes a record of what has already been decided, not a window into the decision. You are safe because someone says you are safe, and you can confirm it later after the fact, when the patch appears publicly. Alongside security, another form of consolidation takes place, one that is easy to miss because it feels like normal industry structure. The partner ecosystem becomes the true governing body of Android. The platform's future is shaped in meetings that are not public. Roadmaps are shared under NDA. Hardware requirements are decided in coordination with top manufacturers and silicon vendors. The public open source project remains, but it increasingly functions as the place where decisions are published, not where they are formed. This does not mean the public project is useless. Far from it. AOSP still matters as a reference implementation, as a base for certain products, as a tool for researchers, as a mechanism for legal openness, and as a shared foundation that keeps Android from becoming fully proprietary in a straightforward way. It also matters as a cultural anchor because as long as AOSP exists, Android can still claim a relationship to openness. But the nature of that openness has changed. It is no longer the openness of watching something being built. It is the openness of being able to inspect the blueprint after the building is finished. That is the illusion of openness, and it is powerful precisely because nothing appears to break. Users still get updates. Developers still build apps. Manufacturers still ship devices. The code is still published. Headlines do not scream because there is no single dramatic event. There is only drift. There is only the gradual replacement of a participatory process with a scheduled release. There is only the gradual relocation of the most important parts of the system into channels and layers that are not governed by public collaboration. And because the user experience keeps improving in many ways, the drift is easy to dismiss. Most people do not care about source code. They care that their phone is fast, stable, and secure. They care that their camera works and their battery lasts and their payments go through. They're not wrong. For them, the modern Android model delivers real benefits. Modular updates can keep devices safer. Trunk-stable development can reduce bugs. Compatibility rules can ensure apps work. The industrial supply chain can deliver better hardware faster. The story is not that Android became worse. The story is that Android became different. It became mature. It became a platform designed for industrial coordination rather than open improvisation. It became an OS whose most important relationships are with silicon vendors and top OEMs rather than with bedroom coders. It became a system where the most consequential updates flow through proprietary distribution channels, even if the source code is eventually published. It became a project where code can exist publicly, but remain dormant until a private configuration enables it. It became a timeline you cannot stand inside. The emotional difference between those eras is hard to quantify, but it can be felt in the rituals that disappeared. The early culture had a strange intimacy. People talked about builds the way music fans talk about bootlegs, raw versions that let you hear the song before it is polished. They traded logs. They celebrated small wins. They endured boot loops and crashes because the act of participation was part of the value. When Android became stable infrastructure, that romance faded. The new model does not need romance. It needs reliability. Yet something is lost when a platform that once invited participation becomes something you can only observe after the fact. The loss is not just for hobbyists. It is for the broader concept of user agency. An operating system is a layer of power. It mediates how you communicate, what you can install, what you can remove, what you can modify, how your data is protected, and how your device can be repurposed. When the OS is open in time, it creates the possibility of collective oversight. It creates a way for independent researchers to spot issues early. It creates a path for alternative visions to exist alongside the mainstream. When the OS is only open retrospectively, oversight becomes delayed, alternatives become expensive, and the mainstream becomes more dominant by default. This is why the question at the end is not a legal question. It is a cultural one. Is an operating system open if you cannot follow its evolution as it happens? Is an operating system open if the most important changes arrive as finished blocks rather than visible streams? Is an operating system open if its behavior depends on private configuration and proprietary distribution? Is an operating system open if the public codebase functions more like an archive than a workshop? There is no clean verdict that satisfies everyone because the trade-offs are real. The era of visible chaos could not scale forever without consequences. The era of industrial stability delivers real safety and consistency. The question is not whether the modern Android model is rational. It is. The question is who it is optimized for. And the answer, increasingly, is that it is optimized for partners, for supply chains, for predictable product cycles, for the managed ecosystem that sells billions of devices, not for the community that once treated Android as a shared project. The most telling symbol of this shift is not a logo change or a marketing slogan. It is a gap. The quiet, empty space between releases. The months where the public repository does not reflect what is shipping. The most telling symbol of this shift is not a logo change or a marketing slogan. It is a gap. The quiet, empty space between releases. The months where the public repository does not reflect what is shipping. The months where the public is asked to wait. In that waiting, openness becomes a scheduled event. It becomes something that happens twice a year, not something that exists continuously. It becomes the kind of openness that arrives on someone else's timetable. If you are a large manufacturer, the timetable feels like clarity. If you are a silicon vendor, the timetable feels like relief. If you are a consumer, the timetable is invisible because you experience updates as they arrive on your device. But if you are a downstream maintainer, if you are a researcher, if you are a builder of alternative systems, the timetable is everything. It determines whether you can keep up, whether you can contribute, whether you can verify, whether you can compete, whether you can sustain the work at all. This is why the phrase Android did not close overnight is not a comfort. It is a warning about how power shifts in modern platforms. You can maintain the symbols of openness while changing its substance. You can keep publishing code while removing the ability to participate. You can keep the license while moving the living system into private channels. You can keep the repository while changing the clock. And that is the quiet trick at the heart of the story. Android did not need to stop being open source to stop feeling open. It only needed to stop being open in time. Now, if you have ever wondered why fewer people talk about ROMs the way they used to, why alternative builds feel rarer, why the ecosystem seems more homogenized, why the dominant players feel more dominant, why the excitement of watching the platform evolve has been replaced by waiting for official drops, this is the thread that connects it all. It is not nostalgia, it is a structural shift. It is the difference between a workshop and a factory. Both can produce remarkable things, but only one invites you to watch the work in progress. In the end, Android's transformation is not a scandal. It is a case study. It shows how openness can be redefined without being revoked. It shows how a platform can remain open source while becoming less open as a lived experience. It shows how the most meaningful form of openness, the ability to see and influence a system as it devolves, can be replaced by retrospective transparency, the ability to inspect the past after the future has already shipped. So the next time you hear someone say Android is still open, the honest response is yes. But open in what sense? Open to download, yes. Open to build, yes. Open to study, eventually. Open to participate in real time, less and less. Open as a process, no longer. Open as a schedule, increasingly. If you want more stories like this, stories that take familiar technology and trace the invisible shifts beneath it, follow the work, share it with someone who still thinks open source is only about licenses, and keep asking the uncomfortable question that modern platforms would rather you forget. Not whether the code is available, but when it becomes available, and what happens in the time you are not allowed to see. Android still works. In many ways, it works better than ever. Phones are faster, safer, more reliable, and more consistent across the world. Nothing is obviously broken, and that is precisely why this shift escaped attention. But openness is not something you notice when it disappears all at once. It fades, it stretches. It turns participation into patience and collaboration into consumption. The code is still published, but the story is already finished by the time you read it. The building is complete by the time you are allowed inside. So the question that remains is not whether Android is open source in theory, but whether an operating system can still call itself open when the community no longer shares the present tense. If this story made you rethink what openness really means, share it with someone who still believes transparency is just a checkbox. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the invisible shifts shaping modern technology. And remember, the most important changes are rarely the ones that make headlines. They are the ones that quietly change the rules while everyone is still looking at the screen.